So welcome to today's workshop on developing fair, consistent, and transparent grading practices. Each professor's grading policies reflect their own beliefs about student learning, motivation, and success, and they often vary across campus within individual departments, even between instructors in the same department that are teaching the same course. So faculty might believe that their grading practices are fair, but oftentimes grading policies inadvertently perpetuate achievement disparities. And while grades might be suggestive of how an individual instructor grades rather than a valid assessment of student learning, there are some more serious considerations for grading equity that we'll talk about. Traditional grading approaches often advantage privileged students while disadvantaging historically underserved students, which can interfere with our retention and our success efforts. So in this workshop, we'll explore some research-based grading practices that promote equity and examine why some policies might contribute to achievement gaps. And I'll be your presenter today. My name is Amanda Smothers. I'm the Teaching and Learning Coordinator in the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning at NIU. I'll take your questions throughout and at the end of the presentation. So if you have any specific questions related to what we're covering, feel free to post to the chat thread or raise your hand or just unmute yourself and I'll address those as they come up. So I won't have you do the the introduction in the text chat because I already know who you are. But I do like to do a check-in with my students when I'm doing synchronous classes and have them just share an emoji of how they're doing on that day. So if you want to share an emoji in the chat, you can do so. I'll share mine. I've been sick for the past week or so, so if my voice gives out, I apologize for that.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I've got my ginormous bottle of water here, so.
Oh, good.
All right. So workshop goals. Goals for today discuss some issues related to fairness, consistency, and transparency in grading with an eye toward equity. First, aligning grading with your teaching philosophy. Articulating your teaching philosophy is going to be the first step in that process. Grading equitably, how can you create an equitable grading system? How can you determine whether your current grading system is equitable? Policies for late assignments. What are some of the equity issues involved in late work policies? What are some examples of equitable late work policies? Effective communication, having a grading process and policies that are created with equity in mind is great, but students have to be aware of those policies in order for them to be truly fair, consistent, and transparent. Grading rubrics. They're one grading tool that could help you develop a fair grading practice by standardizing your grading and helping you focus on established criteria and levels of performance when you're grading student work or performances. And there's something that you can give to students ahead of time so that they know to how they're going to be graded. And there's where some transparency comes in. And then finally, providing feedback. Providing timely feedback is essential to establishing equitable grading practices, and feedback throughout the learning process is essential for student learning. So one step toward making your grading system more equitable is by aligning that grading system with your teaching philosophy. You might need to articulate your teaching philosophy before you can articulate your grading philosophy. And there are a lot of online tools that can help you find your teaching philosophy or develop it. We won't cover those here, but I do encourage you to seek out those tools, particularly if you've never developed or articulated your teaching philosophy or it's been a long time since you've revisited it. And I'll share some resources in my follow-up email and on one of the slides at the end of this workshop that can kind of point you in a direction of resources that'll help you develop your teaching philosophy. So some questions that you want to consider when you're aligning your grading system with your teaching philosophy might be, what are the most important things that you want your course grading system to accomplish for you as the learning facilitator? What are the most important things you want your course grading system to accomplish for your students? What do your grades represent? So for example, do your grades represent student mastery of established learning objectives? Or do they represent students' performance relative to their peers? Which do you think might be fairer and more consistent? Do you believe only a certain number of students should be able to achieve an A in your course? Some faculty have that perspective, or do you believe in commending students' demonstration of learning by conferring a commensurate grade? Could your current grading policies be contributing to equity gaps? Do you believe student work should be assessed based on a specific set of criteria, which is criterion grading, or do you believe student work should be assessed in terms of how it measures up against the work of other students, or normative grading? And how might criterion grading possibly be more equitable than normative grading? And then do you believe in assessing grade penalties for late work and other infractions? Why or why not? And how might that affect equity in your grading practices? So, in an article by Katrina Schwartz called How Teachers Are Changing Grading Practices with an Eye on Equity, she includes a quote from high school physics teacher Nick Sigmund, who points out that students are very much aware that school is a game and that your grades aren't based on how well you understand something, but on how well you play the game. He goes on to say that it's easy to get defensive about your grading policy. As a teacher, you want to believe that you're doing the right thing and that your grades are meaningful and that you've figured out a system of grading that makes sense. Um, but he also explains his new thoughts about grading after considering grading for equity. And he says that, quote, I have to be more thoughtful. My grades are now meant to be an accurate reflection of a student's mastery of the standards set by the state in high school physics. So he argues that if a student can display their knowledge of those standards without doing the homework, the student shouldn't be penalized for that in their grade, especially because students all have different responsibilities outside of school that can make getting homework done difficult. So that's an example for a high school teacher, but I think it definitely applies to higher education as well. So let's talk about some tips for grading for equity. And these come from a variety of sources, including that aforementioned article. But one of them is to grade by standard or outcome rather than by assignment. So that involves assessing whether students are mastering standards or course objectives rather than receiving points simply for completing assignments. And then this kind of goes along with that, but ditching homework and extra credit grades. So students are graded, again, based on their progress towards established standards or objectives rather than encouraging points grabs for smaller homework assignments and extra credit. And then the idea is that moving away from that type of grading, those smaller assignments, then the goal is that students will see that the only way to improve their grade is by mastering those standards or those objectives. Another tip is to ensure that grades reflect what students know, not whether they're compliant. So in other words, emphasizing mastery rather than behavior management in your grading practices. Should students be getting a grade based on how compliant they are, or should they be assessed based on their mastery of course objectives, and which is fairer or more equitable? Also think about whether your grading practices inadvertently punish students with fewer resources. So for example, a student who comes into your classroom with less content knowledge or preparation from previous schooling, they might need to make more effort, revise an assignment more times, or take an exam more times to master that course content than someone coming into your course with more resources and preparation from their prior educational experiences. So should the former student who ends the course having mastered the content be punished by always having a lower grade than the latter student who also ends the course by having mastered the content, but who began the course by earning better grades because they had more resources? So kind of just something to think about is averaging grades an equitable practice in light of this particular scenario. Also, think about whether you should be grading student participation and maybe how you should be grading it if you do grade it. So what are you looking for when you assess whether students are quote unquote participating? Are you looking for eye contact, note taking, speaking up in class, not having side conversations while you're lecturing or giving instructions? And how might elements of so-called participation reveal inequity? So for example, if eye contact is a criteria for participation, how are students who feel uncomfortable with or are unable to make eye contact, whether for cultural reasons or because they're autistic or because they have a visual impairment or blindness or some other reason, How are they affected by this policy that they cannot adhere to, and how might this be inequitable for those students? And just a broader question to think about is how might your unintentional bias toward the learning style that you prefer be affecting your students' grades? Retakes, resubmissions, and revisions. So one tip or one suggestion for equitable grading is to require retakes if students earn below a certain grade. That encourages students to continue the learning process rather than just earning the poor grade and moving on. If one of our goals in teaching is to facilitate student learning, then we need to think outside of the box for ways to do that, and this is one possible strategy. Students who earn a grade that indicates mastery and demonstrates their learning goals are met don't have to retake the exam, but students who fall below mastery or do not demonstrate that learning goals have been met need to take another look at the course material, continue the learning process, and then retake the assessment to determine whether they've progressed. So the new grade would replace the old grade, not be averaged with it, because the more recent grade actually represents the student's mastery and learning progress. Another issue is group work. So one thing for equitable group work grading might be to provide individual assessment for group work instead of a group grade. Collaboration is important, so group work obviously shouldn't be avoided, but a group grade doesn't necessarily indicate whether individual students have mastered the standards, so that's why, to be fair and equitable and have students' grades reflect their own learning, individual grades should be assigned for group work. That also helps with the common problem of one or two students doing all the work and the rest of the students earning the same grade. And then another possible strategy, and this doesn't work for everyone. I don't do this because I like to provide responses I like using my students' names in my feedback, but this is one way that you can grade for equity is using anonymous grading. This works either for assignments that they might turn in, assessments that they might turn in hard copy. You can have them put maybe their CID on it or their student ID, or give them a letter or a number to put on there so that they, in lieu of their name, or you can enable anonymous grading on Blackboard if you're collecting assignments in that way, and then just tell them not to put their name on the assignment itself, because that kind of will defeat the purpose, so that you can do anonymous grading and then tell them that that's what you're doing. And this is to kind of avoid unconscious bias or biases that we may not be aware of from impacting how we grade individual students, whether that's grading someone better than their work quote unquote deserves because of whatever subconscious feelings we have about that student, or worse, grading worse than they deserve for the same reason. So anonymous grading is just one way that we could eliminate those unconscious bias from our grading system. And then finally, just going back to that quotation on the initial slide about the resource, the article, is just consider what your goals are for grading and student learning, and think about whether students' grades should be based on how well they know something or whether they can play the proverbial game. Let's talk about late work. One grading policies that you do want to consider through an equity-minded lens is the late work policy. So we'll talk about some questions that we should consider while we're developing our policies for late assignments, and then also while we're enforcing those policies. So one question is, what do your grades represent? And this is a question that I've posed before, but what are our grades represent? Do they represent how well students are learning, or do they represent their compliance with rules? And then what should they represent ideally?
Yeah, I think this
Go
is
ahead.
a fascinating question. Ideally, they represent the student's mastery of the learning outcomes of the course. But I think too often They represent the student's ability to manage their time and to show
Mm-hmm.
up to class on particular days, to choose what readings are important and do those readings, to complete assignments, you know, those kinds of things that
Mm-hmm.
aren't necessarily getting at do they understand, but are getting closer to are they able to, as you say, play the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, executive functioning skills are definitely an important equity consideration. Not everyone comes into college with those executive functioning skills like time management, or, knowing how to study for an exam in college versus how they studied for an exam in high school, because the exams are going to be different. So definitely, like, how can we develop uh, our students' executive functioning skills so that they succeed in our class and so that they can they're equipped with the tools to meet those learning objectives, right? Um, all right, so another question that we might consider is, what assumptions do we make when students don't turn in work? And then what might be the reality, and how can we find out what the reality is? Um, this gets to, maybe some obstacles that students might be facing that we're not aware of. For example, do they have anxiety? Do they have executive functioning skill gaps? Do they have a lack of necessary resources, or do they have, external professional or personal obligations that are getting in the way of them um, turning in their work for our class? And then how can we address equity issues like this while not penalizing students because we assume that they're just unmotivated? So um, one way to kind of know why students aren't turning in work or know the student circumstances is by getting to know our students, um, and by creating those connections and making them feel like they can come to us when they have issues um, around either turning in work or something happens in their life, and they need to talk about it with someone. So that's one thing that we can do, is just hold those assumptions, maybe don't assume the worst of our students, and then also make it so that they feel connected to us in our class and comfortable enough that they can come to us when they're missing an assignment or when they're having difficulty managing everything, so we can help them succeed. Um, Another one, equity issue focuses on ourselves. So are we just grading too many things? Can we switch to grading, for example, just summative assessments and providing minor feedback on formative assessments, but not giving a grade for those smaller assignments? Um, and then how do you encourage students to do ungraded formative work and see the value in it? And I think that's a challenge. And so we often, at least this is what I've done before, is you kind of load these smaller assignments so that they actually do them for credit. Um, and if you don't assign points to it, are they actually going to do it, or how can you get them to do it if there's no points attached to it? Or do you trick them into thinking there's points attached to it when there really aren't? Like, yeah,
Yeah,
this is worth a million points, and then if they
I
actually look at the syllabus and the grade breakdown, it's not actually factored in there.
I have found that students don't really read the syllabus very carefully at all. And
Mm-hmm.
I can have any number of ungraded assignments that they will take very seriously and do, and then they will wonder where their grade is, you know. So yeah, I have drafts due for all of the
Mm-hmm.
major assignments, and I make those deadlines as if this is the day that the assignment is due,
Mm-hmm.
but all I'm doing is giving them feedback and handing it back to them because the assignment is actually due a week later. Um,
Yeah.
and that's the assignment that I actually grade. But the vast majority of my students will do a draft even though it's not graded because I haven't said it's not graded. If I say it's not
Mm-hmm.
graded, I've experimented with that. If I say it's not graded, then about half the class will do it.
Mhm.
But if I say nothing about whether or not it's going to be graded, then pretty much the whole class will do it.
Yeah.
Which is kind of strange.
Yeah, and I've done the same thing with like peer review. And it's always this semester, I don't have my peer reviews graded. Like I don't have, we do peer review in class on their drafts, and so they're not getting credit for the peer review, but I haven't mentioned that to them. So I'm waiting to see. We our first peer review next week. I'm waiting to see like how many students actually bring a draft to peer review, and then we'll see about that. And then I also have face-to-face and online and hybrid, all different modalities. So I'm going to see what the differences are, because I've been great giving them credit for it in the past, and kind of the participation has actually gone down over the years, probably because of COVID, whatever. But even when it was part of their grade, I would might maybe get half the class who submitted a draft for and actually did the peer review. So yeah, it's tough trying to make grading manageable for yourself, while also holding trying to get students to participate. So thinking about, what kind of grading system is realistic for you. What's a grading plan that's manageable so that you're not behind on your grading, so you can keep up with it. In addition to, encouraging students to do that important foundational work. And then if you're behind on your grading, how are students, going to see the value in turning in their own work on time? So that's kind of just the leading by example. I'm going to give you feedback in a timely manner. So, you should turn in your work on time. And then finally is letting students turn in piles of late work just to get the points pointless. So if we maybe switch to just providing feedback on formative assessments and not entering them to a gradebook, are they more meaningful for learning? Research says yes, they are, but that's kind of combined with, there's a whole movement around ungrading, which I, wish I had the time to thoroughly incorporate into my own teaching. But there's a whole movement around ungrading and how it's actually beneficial for student learning.
Ungrading is something I'm definitely going to look into the second I get tenure.
Right.
I think it's something that's a little political.
Yeah.
In this
Yeah, I
at
think
this
that like
moment.
the stepping stone to it is kind of standards-based grading or objective-based grading. Grading students based, like you've got your objectives, and then do they meet those objectives? If not, they got to go back. So kind of like a pass fail, does or does not meet objectives kind of thing. So there's kind of like baby steps along the way that you could do, which I will do, and we'll see. I have so many classes that I'm teaching at so many different schools, and they all have different rules. So that's also difficult when you're an adjunct. So let's talk about some options for equitable late work policies. So first, extension requests. How can students request an extension? Could you maybe implement an online form to standardize the process, make it maybe a little bit less intimidating than having to contact you directly? Do students have to prove that they need an extension? What equity issues might that proof introduce into your grading practices? Could students instead maybe be required to reflect on why they need an extension so they can determine whether it's in their power to solve problems that might be getting in the way of their success? So one thing that is difficult for especially like first generation students, I was a first generation college student, is, you don't want to seem like you don't want to feel like you're out of place, like you don't belong. And so you think, if I ask for an extension, or if I go to tutoring, or, insert student service here, that's an indication that I don't belong in college, when in fact those, resources are there for them, for all students, and the successful students take advantage of those. So one way that we can kind of mitigate that trepidation that students might feel is by implementing sort of a standardized extension request policy. Or another option is to use late passes. So students can be given a number of quote unquote late passes for assignments in a semester, so they can turn in a certain number of assignments late within a reasonable time frame in case life circumstances necessitate it, and no reason is required for that. Something else that I've tried out is floating deadlines, or also called flexible due dates, and that involves providing a range of due dates for work. So for example, you might offer students incentives to turn in their work early, like getting more thorough or early feedback on an assessment, or allowing resubmissions with revisions for early submissions by a certain date, and then having that final deadline. So you have kind of like a range when they can turn something in. Another option is to have access to students' work in progress. So you can allow students to submit assignments that aren't yet completed to see how they're progressing. For example, you could have students provide you with a link to works in progress, either through O365, or if they're using Google Drive or Google Docs, they can give you a link to their documents that they're working on, so you can check in on their work before it's due and maybe provide some feedback that might help them succeed. And that way, might help them also with some time management. So you can say, oh, we've got it due in a week, and I see you've only written 1 page of your 10-page paper. What can I do to help you, move this along? And then optional or self-selected homework, that involves not grading homework, but providing it as an opportunity for students to learn, to progress towards course outcomes ahead of their graded assessment. So this option would involve work on the faculty member's part to help students see, first of all, the value in completing this work. Why should they do it if they're not, getting a grade on it, or they're not getting credit for it? And then part of the value added is the faculty member providing substantive and meaningful feedback on the students' optional or self-selected homework, so that they can improve on that ahead of their graded assessment. So regardless of what our grading policies are, it's really important that we communicate those policies to students clearly and effectively, so that they understand how their academic performance will translate to their course grade. Demystifying the grading system is an important step toward equity. We can do that in our syllabus, but as you mentioned, students aren't really looking at their syllabus. I read it to them on the first day of class, and it's probably the last time that they look at it, unless I come back to it. So throughout the semester at various points, when it makes sense to do so, coming back to the syllabus policies. For example, right before an assessment is due, we could look at the policies around assessments in our gradebook, and look at the grading scale, and how much this is worth of our course grade, etc. So some important elements of what we communicate to students should include explaining the grading process. So how do assessments align with learning materials and activities? How do they align with our course objectives? How will students be involved in the grading process, if at all? Who's going to do the grading? How are you going to ensure that grading is consistent and fair, etc. Also explaining grading policies, so due dates, late work, what's the grading scale, are things graded on a curve, etc. Also explaining the grading criteria, so what elements students will be graded on, what the levels of performance look like, how the criteria are weighted in the overall grade, and then we can see the rubric example here. So we want to explain also what grading tools we're going to use. Is there a rubric? I recommend giving the rubric to a student before they've completed the assessment, so that they can, check themselves, have them grade themselves based on the rubric. I've done that before too, before they turn it in as part of their self-assessment, so that they can identify areas that they need to improve for revision before they turn it in to me. You can use a checklist, you can use a rating scale, You can use various forms of self-assessment. You can do peer grading as well. As I mentioned before, returning work in a timely manner. So have a policy for returning work to students and try your best to adhere to it. And if you do need to veer away from that for any reason, because we have lives too and things come up in our own lives, just as they do for students, then we want to be communicative about that. So whenever we need to veer from that, we need to give students, you know, that new date when things will be ready by, when their grades will be posted or their feedback will be posted. So I mentioned rubrics. What can rubrics do generally? And they can be used for any type of assessment, but they help us to set anchor points along a quality continuum so that we can set a reasonable and appropriate expectations for students and consistently judge how well they've met them. They also divide an assignment into its component parts. They provide a detailed description of what constitutes different levels of performance for each part, and that shows students how they can succeed on an assessment. So what can they do for us and our students? They can function as an instructional and an evaluation tool. They can help us facilitate timely feedback because we've, you know, kind of put a lot of that work at the front by creating the rubric with the descriptors about what performance looks like. And then we fill that out when we're grading. It can facilitate timely feedback by cutting down on how much commenting we need to do on student work. So we can get things back to our students faster, but then we also need to teach our students how to read the rubric, how to interpret it, what it means. It can help us refine our teaching by better organizing or defining our expectations for our students. It can help facilitate communication between us and our students. It can prepare and guide students' work if we give them that grading rubric ahead of time. And it can also help us assess student mastery of learning objectives and make sure that that's what we're actually assessing too. So ultimately, rubrics can help us to promote fair, consistent, and transparent assessment and evaluation practices. Some considerations that you'll want to address when you're creating or selecting a pre-existing rubric include, does the rubric align with our course outcomes or objectives? Ideally, it would. Does it include performance levels? So different levels of performance, what do they look like? Does it describe what students need to do to master the criteria? Do the rubric criteria reflect current notions of mastery in your field? Are the rubric scores well defined? Does the rubric seem to be fair and bias-free? Does it allow for inter-rater reliability? So if someone else were to use this rubric to grade your students, would they get pretty much the same scores that you would give them? And then, is the rubric useful, practical, and manageable? So feedback is, as we know, important to improving students' learning and performance. So to try to address equity issues and gaps in our courses, we have to try to provide students with equitable opportunities to learn and progress towards the mastery of our learning outcomes. So providing substantive and constructive feedback is an important way to do that. But not all feedback is equally helpful. So these are just a few characteristics of effective feedback. First, it's prioritized. We want to choose what to provide feedback on. We don't want to provide too much feedback. That can be overwhelming to students and it can lead to their feelings of hopelessness. So what are the few most important things a student should focus on for improvement? Let's prioritize our feedback to include the most pressing issues and how students can improve rather than pointing out every single little detail of what they got wrong. It's also descriptive. So we want to be specific in feedback on student work rather than just vague platitudes, good job, needs work. We want to provide specific areas a student excelled in that's using criteria language. And then it's also constructive. So similarly, when a student needs improvement in an area, we want to provide specific details about the student's areas for improvement. So in other words, providing the student with evidence, telling them specifically what they did well on, what they need to improve on. And then what should they do with that? Effective feedback is actionable. So be specific in telling students what they need to do with your feedback. What should they do differently next time? Be specific, make it clear what action students need to take to resolve issues in their work and to close those gaps in their mastery of objectives. And then finally, as I've mentioned already, effective feedback is timely. So we want to give students feedback that comes in time for them to actually do something with it. If it doesn't come until 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later, it might have lost its meaning and usefulness, and chances are students will have probably perpetuated those same mistakes in the meantime. So you've been sharing along the way, but what are maybe your current grading practices, some changes you'd like to make, any discipline-specific questions that you have, or what did you think of some of the topics that are raised here?
Sure. So current grading practices, I have a series of assignments. Some of them are individual, some of them are group assignments, and they are graded on those assignments and then also participation, and that is that. On some of the things that you were talking about, I have a rubric of sorts in my syllabus in which I say, like, here's what an A is, here's what a B is, here's what a C is, here's what a D is. That's not really a grading rubric, for a particular assignment. I haven't done those in a long time because I found that they turned my students into little lawyers where they were sort of like, you took off 3 points for this, but you should have only taken off 2 points, and then you give me 1 more point and all this stuff. And I just sort of did away with all the point grading in general and just went to letter grades. So my students will get an A, or like an A plus, an A, A minus, B, that kind of thing, and then those correspond to points, but they won't get like 83.2 or something. They'll only have an
Yeah,
82 or an 85. Um,
yeah, and I've done that too. So in the grade book, it shows up as a letter grade, but I do use rubrics to grade them. They just don't see the individual points values, but they do see like
yeah,
how I filled out the interactive rubric online, and then they see a letter grade in the grade book.
yeah, yeah. So you're doing rubrics through Blackboard or some kind of like course management
Yeah.
program?
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I may go back to it just with a better rubric. you know, um, because I felt that the rubric that I was using just, you know, it took so long to grade every individual thing. Whereas when I'm reading something, or I'm reading an assignment, I'm like, I am reading an A paper right now. I'm reading a B paper right now. Like I I have that kind of feeling, and that feeling is based on how well the paper is responding to the assignment. You know.
Hmm.
But I guess I could be more transparent about that from the outset, and then the students would be able to. But the thing is, once I tell them exactly what I'm looking for, then that's what they're going to put forth to me. Like
Hmm.
they will cut to measure, which also is sometimes difficult because
Hmm.
sometimes, you know, then the rubric has to be really, really clear. And sometimes they will misinterpret a rubric and do an assignment, you know, to fit a rubric instead of just doing the assignment. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Yeah.
So I have struggled with that. Um, Late work I don't accept, and the reason is that it just became so difficult to make a consistent policy
Hmm.
uh, of like, okay, I accept some late work for half credit or this or that. Once I just said no, then then there wasn't an issue about it.
Hmm.
Um, Now, extension requests I do grant. I say I need to know in advance. You can't tell me
Hmm.
on the day that you need an extension, but a week out, if you're looking at things,
Right.
I'll grant it on a case by case basis. Um, and I do some anonymous grading where I can.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I have struggled with, how to make policies that are clear and that are enforceable, and then also how to make sure that everybody has a fair shot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not a simple a simple thing to do. Um,
No.
and there isn't any one policy that's necessarily better. But I think as long as we're, transparent about those policies and why we have them with students, I think
You
that's a
know,
great, first step towards that. Like this is the policy, but this is why. Another strategy is involving students in developing those policies because then they can kind of take ownership over them as well. So I've done this with students where I've done it in different ways, like where we've created sort of a class covenant, and they,
mm-hmm.
developed that. I've had them create their own grading rubrics based on they had to do, research on whatever the writing genre was and what the the um, the standards for that genre were. And so they created their own rubric, and it turned out pretty much the same as a rubric I would have created, but they understood, why those criteria were there because they had done the research on it. So I think, transparency and also involving students
you know,
as well.
yeah, I struggle with the rubrics because I find that I am deciding on a grade and then trying to reverse engineer the rubric to arrive at that grade. Um, because I the assessment is in me. Like I went to school, I got a degree, and now I know what an A is and what a B is and what a C is, what a D is. I've outlined those in my syllabus. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I find students will be like, well, I did 100% of the assignment, so I should get an A. And it's like, no, you turned in the assignment, and that is a C. Or
Yeah.
maybe a D if you turned in the assignment and it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, so yeah, I struggle with that. With um, once I create a rubric, then I've sort of locked myself into a particular way of grading an assignment.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think, I mean, that's a good point. On the other hand, you know, we want student like I mean, it's all in how you create the rubric too. So you can create it to
yeah.
be very prescriptive, or you can create it to give you a little bit more room for, or give your students maybe more room for creativity or whatever it is, whatever
Mm-hmm.
else you want. Like I've done rubrics where, the highest grade exemplary, the part of the descriptor is, it meets all of the requirements, but there's something extra in there. It goes above and beyond in some way through creativity or, whatever, so that
Yeah.
there's that room for me to kind of give credit to students who kind of go above and beyond. Um,
Yeah, I think maybe I just like some examples of
yeah,
rubrics that
I
would
can
work for
send you some
you.
examples. Hmm.
Because it's something that I've kind of set aside because who has the time?
I know it
But
takes so much time. It does. It takes a lot of time.
but as I'm trying to rethink my pedagogy and continually rethink my pedagogy, I
Mhm.
think rubrics are something I need to take up again. Um, yeah, and I have never offered extra credit or accepted late work,
Mhm.
but but I, I know I understand the point about just pointless points. Like these
Yeah.
giving points for everything. I did do reading quizzes, you know, to ensure that they were reading, and to some degree that worked.
Mhm.
But, you know, then I'm like, is it my responsibility to ensure that they're reading?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
important that somebody in the class reads so that we can have a discussion, but it's not actually important that everybody in the class reads for every class, even though I say that it kind of is, you know?
And I mean, if that's kind of your philosophy around it, you can maybe not assign every reading to every student in the class for every week. So maybe have them
Mm-hmm.
read certain readings and
Mm.
come prepared with some discussion questions, that can engage their peers. Um, so that they're responsible for a certain number of readings, but they know that they,
Mm.
don't have to pretend like they read if they didn't on the weeks when they're not responsible for those readings.
Yeah, I hate that.
Like, I hate it because I do reading journals for my online classes.
Yeah.
Um, so, there's different prompts for each one, and for each week. And then I can tell when you have not done the reading
Yeah.
and you're trying to do the reading journal because you're not actually saying anything.
Yeah.
So,
Animal Farm is about a farm, and there are animals on it, and best part of the
yep.
farm is yeah. No,
Yeah.
um yeah, there was something else. I do the floating deadlines thing. I was telling you about how I have drafts due and then finals
Mhm.
due, and the drafts are not graded. They get feedback on them, and they're almost certainly guaranteed to do better on the final assignment if they do a draft, but they don't
Mhm.
have to do a draft. But I also don't make it explicit that they don't have to do a draft either.
Right.
But by the second assignment, they've kind of figured that out.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially if, they
the
forgot to turn in their draft the first time and they're like, "Oh, wait, nothing
and
happened."
nothing happened. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the same is true of the reading. If they
Mhm.
they work really hard to read something and then I don't talk about it in class, that's
Right.
bad. And then they're like,
Well, it
well, I
is.
don't have to do the reading in this class.
Well, and then, on the other hand, too, if they do all that work to do the reading and then we just lecture them on the exact same thing they just read,
Exactly.
then, why should I spend all that time doing the reading when you're just going to tell me what was in the textbook reading, right? So, like, doing something with it is, what's some critical thinking questions that we can consider, or like, let's apply it to something in the classroom.
Yeah.
Because that's another like common thing that um, that happens is, faculty are like, how can I get my students to do the reading? I just end up, creating a PowerPoint and then summarizing everything because they need to have that reading. And it's like, well, you're disincentivizing them from doing the reading by
Yeah.
summarizing
Then
everything
don't
that they should
assign
have
the
read.
reading, just show them the PowerPoint slide.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're
You
not going to
know.
get them to do the reading by telling them what they should have read. You're going to get them to do the reading by telling them that they're going to have to apply it in class, and and then holding them accountable for that in class.
You know. The other thing that you said about not providing too much feedback, I've really tried to do that in the past few
Mhm.
years, and it's been much better for
Mhm.
everybody.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when I went to school, I would turn in an assignment and it would come soaked in red, and that was what I was
Mhm.
taught and what I learned how to do.
Right.
And it was just an onerous process. It would take days to read these papers, and
Mhm.
comment line by line on them, and especially on grammar,
Yeah.
grammar issues I would comment on constantly. And now I just little paragraph at the end. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is what I enjoyed about your paper. This is what you could do differently. Thanks very much. Like,
Yeah.
here are some issues
Yeah.
that are you should address. Um, and I stopped grading on grammar altogether because as long as I can understand what they're trying to say, then it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really matter all that much.
Right. Yeah, for grammar, for me, I teach writing, so I kind of have to comment on some grammar, but what's the most pressing grammar issue in this person's paper, and then kind of model how to fix it, and then make sure that they know how to fix that for next time. And then the next time I can focus on another grammar issue. But if you're just focusing on everything, then they don't know what to prioritize. They don't know what's important. They kind of
Yeah.
tend to shut down because there's so much that they need to fix for the next time around that they don't know how to do that. So
Yeah, and for me, I just felt like, what is it that I am trying to teach them here
mm-hmm.
by being a grammar stickler? Because really, I'm trying to say, like, oh, you need to learn this for professionalism, or you have to learn this because, this is how academic writing is supposed to be. But it's really just teaching them to write white, like write in a
Yeah.
white way, right?
Yeah.
Like I do,
Mm-hmm.
like a white man would in his 40s.
Yeah.
So that issue kind of, to me, ended it. I was like, well, then
Mm-hmm.
if I understand what my students are trying to say, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Um, and I can say, like, there are some issues with your grammar and you should visit the writing center to try to address them. And if they're interested to hear what those issues are, I can talk about it, but most students aren't really.
No,
Um,
not too much.
yeah.
Even in my classes. So much of what I
Yeah.
have to do with my composition classes is explaining why they're required, or like getting them to understand why it's important that they develop written communication skills
Yeah.
for whatever profession they end up going into. Like, you need to learn to write in specific genres. If you're a nurse, you're going to be writing on someone's charts and you need to be clear and specific. Like if
Yeah.
you're, working in the trades, you've got a work order that you've got to write up after you do a service call, for example.
Yeah.
So just kind of
Exactly.
trying to establish the importance of communication and critical thinking, because that's what I think composition really is too. It's not just developing writing skills, but critical thinking skills and skills for analysis. So I'll send you this list of resources after,
Great.
and I'll also send you some examples of rubrics, um, including the Association of American Colleges and Universities has value rubrics. So those are for like more nebulous things like creative thinking, critical thinking, like intercultural competence. So I'll send you those, but I'll also send you some of the rubrics that I've used for my own writing assignments. Um, and then if you have any questions, you can always contact me. But thanks for joining today to discuss developing fair, consistent, and transparent grading practices. And I will see you later.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I appreciate it.